All right. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So I wanted to comment on something that normally I try to avoid these kinds of things because they usually just wind up being they don't produce a lot of good, and there's enough argumentation as it is amongst us as Muslims. But on occasion I see some things that I really feel if we were simply to just avoid these kinds of things, that we would just bring so much, by not creating unnecessary argumentation and controversy, we would actually bring some good to the community. And especially for people that either want to be in the position of qiyada, of some type of leadership position, or they're claiming the mantle of talib al-ilm, right, as somebody who's supposedly a student of knowledge, then we should be looking to try to, mitigate unnecessary, not only argumentation, because sometimes we will have to have debates or conversations of which perhaps there is some khilaf on an issue. But I feel like a lot of it just very, very quickly descends down into two people just like their egos, right? And so to cut to the chase, there was an exchange on Twitter, which alone probably tells you all that you probably need to know about the whole affair. But there was an exchange on Twitter between two individuals, between Shadi al-Masri, who's an imam on the East Coast, and a gentleman known as Jake Brancatella, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, who goes by Jake the Muslim metaphysician. And so somehow they've had this back and forth about, Ash'ari Aqidah, right, a particular school of thought on terms of Sifat Allah, like on the attributes of Allah, on the attributes of God in Islamic theology, in creedal matters. And then Jake, who I'm not quite sure if he is either Athari or Salafi, but he clearly is not Ash'ari, and he's made some pretty harsh statements against the Ash'ari, to the point of saying that their creed is, completely wrong, and, just making some really, really rough comments. So anyway, in their exchange, apparently there was this idea put forward, can Allah create a logical contradiction, like a square with no sides? And Jake's response to this was, it is well known that Allah's qudra, his power, only attaches to logical possibilities. So I'll stop right there. I think where maybe some of all of us are occasionally forgetting ourselves is in our conversation about the qudra of Allah, about Allah's power or capacity to do things. There is a great assumption that we know Allah's qudra. And what I mean is that we are نحن عارفون بها كاملا, as if we have complete knowledge of Allah's qudra. And so, these kinds of absurdities, which one thing Jake did point out is that these are kind of sometimes like questions that you would get like from an atheist. Can God create, an absurdity? Let's just call it an absurdity, like a square with no sides, or what I would like to say, can Allah create a three-sided square or a four-sided triangle? And the hyper-rationalist would say, no, Allah cannot do something that contradicts logic. Well, what is logic? Logic is a human endeavor, first and foremost. It is not a divine endeavor. It is a human device of knowing things. And even if Allah Ta'ala has given us, right, the capacities to do so, they are still limited as a human framework. And so I think one simple way, not unlike, for instance, the question like, for instance, can Allah have a son? Sometimes as a reaction, you will hear Muslims that will say, no, God cannot have a son. This is outrageous. Of course not, because as Muslims, we reject the idea that Allah Ta'ala, that God has a son, like, for instance, Jesus Christ or Jesus, the son of Mary, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We reject him being the son of God because we believe that God cannot have a son. This, however, is first off, it's just factually incorrect. In what I mean here, nobody flip out. What does Allah Ta'ala say, however, in Surah Az-Zumar, where Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لو أراد الله أن يتخذ ولدا. If Allah had chosen, if Allah had desired, irada, the fi'l madi, the verb that Allah Ta'ala uses is arada. If Allah had desired, if Allah had willed, right, to what? An yattakhidha waladan. If Allah Ta'ala had desired to take a son, lastafa mimma yakhluqu ma yasha. That if Allah Ta'ala had, if he had desired to, if he had wanted to, he most certainly could have done so. If that's what, and he would have selected that son himself. Then Allah attaches to this without any harf of atifa, without any particle, subhanahu. But Allah is above this. So it is simultaneously a possibility, but it is also dismissed as an absurdity. Subhana, huwa Allahul wahid. But rather, Allah Ta'ala is one. Wal qahhar. And he is the one that can compel. He is the supreme being. So, in a similar vein, can Allah create a three-sided square or a four-sided triangle? What we're forgetting is that sometimes Allah may create things that we do not know, and that those things remain hidden in what we call al-ghaib. Those things remain hidden in the unseen, right? And so if, I'm just responding to somebody's question here. You don't know. So that if Allah Ta'ala were to create, for instance, a three-sided square or a four-sided triangle, the real question is not, can Allah do so? But the more important question is, if Allah desired to do so, how would we know it? Because we are incapable, by Allah being Al-Qahhar, Al-Khaliq, Wal-Qahhar, the way that Allah Ta'ala has created us. And this is where it's like, it's really, in our history as Muslims, we have a movement that was known as the Kalam movement, right? Ilm al-Kalam, or, these movements of which people wanted to engage in all of it. And I get it. Sometimes the Muslims were forced to encounter outside ideologies, philosophies, frameworks of which they, had to respond to. But intra-Muslim dialogue, I feel like there's no need to go to this. And that whether you are of the persuasion of the Asha'ira or the Athari, I myself am Athari. I myself am not Ash'ari, I'm Athari. But either school has the capability, and in fact, I would advocate that the real ulama of the Asha'ira, the learned people of the Asha'ira, would advocate for this position, that Allah Ta'ala can create as He so desires, as He so chooses. Like Allah Ta'ala, for instance, in An-Nahu, وَالْخَيْلَ وَالْبِغَالَ وَالْحَمِيرَ لَا تَرْكَبُونَهَا زِينَةً وَيَخْلُقُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And that Allah Ta'ala talks about how He has created horses and mules and donkeys, like you could think of a horse, a mule, and a donkey. They share some similarity, right? Al-khayl wal-bighal wal-hamir, like the himar, right? He's created them so that you can ride upon them. But he says what? وَيَخْلُقُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And Allah creates that which you don't know. This is where if we are going to entertain any kind of postulate, any kind of question, if we're going to entertain it, then we must turn it back to the Quran primarily. أولا نرد إلى القرآن وثانيا إلى سنة أقوال حبيبه عليه الصلاة والسلام. Then of course we have to turn it back to the statements of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وثالثا, right, أقوال وألفاظ أصحابه عليه الصلاة والسلام. And then of course thirdly we should turn it back to the Salaf, to the early companions. And so this might seem like, oh man, this is such a difficult question to answer. This is like some sort of, it's not a trick question. And to be honest, it's actually not a very difficult question to answer, in which we can give an answer that is, I think, satisfying, that does not contradict anything that Allah Ta'ala has told us about himself in his clear book, nor anything from his beloved Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, or from the righteous, from his companions, and from the Salaf after them, radiyallahu anhum jami'an. So the first way to deal with an absurdity: could Allah Ta'ala create a square with no sides, or a three-sided square, or a four-sided triangle? The real question is, if Allah did so to preserve his qudra, huwa ala kulli shay'in qadir, wa huwa al-qahhar, wa huwa yakhluqu ma la na'lamun, ma la na'lamu. Allah Ta'ala, he is the one that he has power over everything, he has measure over everything, he can compel and make anything happen, and he is the one that creates what we don't know. So the answer succinctly would be yes, Allah Ta'ala, if he so desired, could absolutely create a three-sided square or a four-sided triangle. And in doing so, he would create it in a way of which I would be incapable of perceiving it, in the same way that Allah Ta'ala, when we are taught by both the Prophet ﷺ and by Jibreel alayhi salam, that what is taqwa, right? What is it? Is that you worship Allah Ta'ala as if you can see him. But what? وَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ. But though you are not created to be able to see him, takun, right? In the hadith it says what? Though you have no capacity, your very being is incapable of seeing Allah Ta'ala in this life. In this dunya, there is a total incapacity for you to see him, but rather know that he sees you. In a similar way, if Allah Ta'ala were to create the three-sided square or the four-sided triangle, we would have no means of perceiving it, because we are incapable of seeing three-sided squares and four-sided triangles. And so I feel like these questions emerge out of, to be quite honest, what I would call, with all due respect, a kind of juvenile delinquency on the part of the actors here. Is that grow up, stop discussing things that may cause confusion amongst people, that will cause them to have shubahat, that will cause them to have doubts, that may send people to kufr. Because it would be, I would say, on the doorstep of kufr, not to say that Allah could create a three-sided square, but that if he did so, I could see it, if you follow what I'm saying. In the same way that it is kufr to believe that someone is the son of Allah. It is kufr to believe that someone is the son of God. But it is not kufr to believe that Allah Ta'ala could, if He so chose, to have one. That's a totally different one. And that is in line with the Quran and with the Prophet ﷺ and with the Salaf. And so it might seem like this is, wow, man, you know, like if some atheist kafir were to ask me this question, sometimes they ask these questions, especially to the untrained, and they feel, okay, now I've got you on the ropes. I'm going to give you this question of which, you know, you won't be able to twist out of that one. This is actually a knot that's very easy to slip out of. It doesn't bind us up at all. The category and the domain of al-ghaib, of which Allah Ta'ala alone has access to and knowledge of, and can perceive, is something that we cannot. And so perhaps in the unseen realm somewhere, that's where all the unicorns are. That's where all of the three-sided squares and four-sided triangles, perhaps that's where they all exist. But in all seriousness, this is where people, this is why you have great scholars. And now to give a good point that Imam Shadi had mentioned, Imam Malik and some of the great A'imma, right, some of the great Imams of the early part, there are certain statements of the Prophet ﷺ that they would not transmit to the masses out of fear that they would be misunderstood and they would lead people astray. And so I would really highly encourage Jake and Imam Shadi to just maybe take a little social media hiatus and check in with some of your teachers and, you know, really give some thought to what you're doing. Because the other negative outcome of this, and I guess maybe I'll end on this, is that what you're going to do is you're going to already fuel the animosity that exists between Muslims, that shaitan has already, that shaitan has already come and stoked up between us. Sorry, I wanted to plug in my laptop so it doesn't die. When you do this, you are only going to take the fanboys and, you know, these people that have never studied anything, that are now on Team Jake or Team Imam Shadi, that are on Team Athari or Team Ash'ari or Team Salafi or whatever it is, that couldn't probably spell Salafi in Arabic, and most certainly have not read in depth, let alone the so-called school of Aqidah that they follow, and most certainly have not read in depth on the school that they claim to stand against, and yet are going to make takfir on other Muslims, or going to rake them over the coals. And this isn't to say that there are not some valid differences, but this is not the way to do this. And so our job, right, min ijahi aw jihat al-qiyada, right, if you're going to be from the position of leadership, it should be to imbue Muslims with confidence about their religion. This does the very opposite. So I would highly encourage the both of you to think over what you're doing. And your elder, I'm going to pull out my elder card here. Your elder is issuing you a cease and desist order. Maybe we can talk about it offline. I would love to have a conversation with both Imam Shadi and Brother Jake. Maybe we can talk about this offline, but not for the amusement of shaitan and for the sufaha online. وصلوات الله تعالى على النبي الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.